Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone for coming tonight, and welcome to our students, and also welcome to the alumni for coming here tonight. And I'm really excited to be presenting Joseph Marshall. We've had an impulse this year to have different cultures and different traditions tell their stories, and to learn more about some of the different cultures that have perhaps not been given equal opportunities. And so it's just a real honor and privilege to welcome Joseph Marshall. I'm going to let him tell his story, but I'll just say that he's an award-winning author, most prolific, publishing over 15 nonfiction works, novels, short stories, essays, children's books, screenplays, and he's also appeared as well as been a technical advisor in many movies, and including Return to Lonesome Dove. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joseph. Oh, sorry, I have one other thing that I want to present. Joseph has prepared a PowerPoint, and so he's asking that all questions be held to the end. And we're also, just for efficiency purposes, going to ask people to, unless it's really important, not to chat too much during the presentation, because it can become really distracting to try to look at the chat and then also listen to Joseph. And then also, if you don't mind, if at the end there is a question that you would like, we find that it's just easier if that goes through the chat room rather than trying to get people to unmute. And so please hold your questions till the end. And if there are any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. And so with that, I turn it over to Joseph. And I'm not sure what's happening. Oh, I know, I muted everybody.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let me start over. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to be part of your program and your Zoom meeting. I try not to pass up an opportunity like this, because it's always good to tell a perspective that people have never heard before. And I don't mean to imply that I know everything there is to know about Native people or Indigenous people, because I don't. I know a little bit about the culture that I come from, which is the Lakota culture of the Northern Plains, but there are some similarities, not much. But I think the basic topic of my presentation today is going to be what you see on the screen, the impact of the environment on Indigenous Native American, North American cultures. And I chose this topic because people, for whatever reason, think that Native people have a special relationship with the environment, or Mother Earth, or Grandmother Earth. And we do. But it's based on the practicality of living close to nature for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So our beliefs and our societies and our social norms, all of those kinds of things are predicated on our relationship with the environment. From time to time, I'll call it Mother Earth or Grandmother Earth. And that's because that's what we Lakota people and many other cultures call the earth, is either Mother Earth or Grandmother Earth. So my whole point in giving this presentation is to talk about the realities associated with how cultures develop and how things are for us now. And hopefully it'll be informative. And if you already know a lot of this information, just think of it as a refresher course. Darn, it doesn't want to advance. Let's see.
Joseph, we're getting a lot of comments that people can barely hear you. I know that this is really hard, but I'm just wondering if there's any way you could move a little closer, if there's any possible way to move a little.
We'll try.
Okay, thank you.
And have them turn their volume up 100%.
Yeah, they can turn the volume up. My problem right now is I can't advance the screen for whatever reason. No, it doesn't want to advance. Let's see.
If you scroll all the way down to the bottom left, the arrow should show up. Your pointer's almost there, and advance from that point.
Okay.
Got
Cool. Got it. All right. Let's see if I got. Yeah, you're right. Thank you very much. I've seen those arrows there, but I didn't know what to look for. Okay, so let's sort of start at the beginning. The continent we now call North America is older than that name, North America, by a lot, by thousands and thousands of years. And not all, but a lot of the indigenous tribes and peoples who lived here called it Turtle Island. And I'm going to be using the word indigenous or native, because that's really what we are. We're indigenous to this continent. The name came from an ancient story that the land or this continent was formed when a female turtle rose out of the dark depths, watery depths, with mud on her back. And from that mud grew the land, and all the plants and animals lived on it. Obviously, that story is much more involved for a lot of cultures, but that's our reason for calling this continent Turtle Island. So my discussion today will be mostly reference to Turtle Island or North America and indigenous people. So as you can see, there's two images here that sort of depict why we call it that. On the left, both of these are images. The one on the right is a satellite image, and the one on the right is an artist-enhanced image of why we call it North America, or why we call it Turtle Island. And as you can see, it has roughly the shape and the outline of a turtle, which is quite interesting. And when North America, the name came about sometime in the early 1500s, after an Italian mapmaker. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. He wrote a book and he produced a map about the new worlds being what are now North and South America. And two other map makers decided to name those new continents after him, using his first name, Amerigo. And so that's why North and South America are called America. As far as we indigenous peoples are concerned and where we came from or might have come from, there's all kinds of theories. And one popular theory speculates that our ancestors, going way back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, perhaps migrated across the Bering Land Bridge between Asia and Turtle Island, or Asia and what is now Alaska, at least 10,000 years ago, probably more. And our stories and our legends say that we've always been here, but always is a matter of interpretation. For a species that lives barely 100 years, 500 years is always. So it's a relative term. There are, however, similarities between indigenous peoples of Asia and the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, my kind of people. And interestingly enough, recent research has also indicated that there are similarities in our DNA with the Polynesian peoples of the Pacific. So that's all very interesting, and those are theories, and to date, none of those have been absolutely proven. So this is an image of the Bering Land Bridge, where it connects to North America from Asia. And the tan land formations you see are Asia on the extreme upper left, and then Alaska across that stretch of ocean. And the dark brown is where the land bridge was. So the theory is that while that land bridge was there, because the oceans receded because of the ice age, then people just walked across. So that is an interesting possibility. We do know for sure that we have been here, we indigenous peoples have been here for thousands and thousands of years. As few as 10 to 10,000, 10 to 20, 12,000 years, and probably even longer than that. There have been some archaeological discoveries, one in the Yukon Flats, in the Yukon Territory of Canada, about 40 years ago, and it was a tool. It was an L-shaped tool, sort of like a capital L. It was an antler, the antler of an elk, part of an elk antler that had been worked into a hide scraping tool, sort of like a hoe. And when that was radiocarbon dating, and I'm sure some of you know what radiocarbon is, where the half-life of carbon, which is in all natural organic materials, is measured. When that item was radiocarbon dated, it indicated that the carbon dating indicated it was about 27,000 years old, and it was man-made. So those kinds of things suggest that we indigenous people have been around a long, long time. But however we came here, wherever we came from, we went into every part of the continent, not just where the weather was good or where the climate was good or where there were plentiful resources. We inhabited every corner of this continent. And not only did we survive, not only did our ancestors survive, but they thrived as well. And the key to their survival and their development as societies and cultures was to adapt to the natural environment. In other words, they fit in as much as they knew how to fit in without wanting to change it. This map indicates 10 areas of North America, all the way from the Arctic in the far, far north, and below that is the subarctic, and you can see the different color variations of the other areas with different distinct names. Along the ocean is the northwest coast, and then there's the California coast, and inland from that is the plateau, the Great Basin, and the southwest. And of course, where I come from, where my particular tribe, the Lakota, come from, is in the middle of the plains. It's one of the biggest culture areas. And east from there, of course, in the green is the northeast woodlands. And below that, in the lighter green, is the southeast woodlands. And the plains were a virtually treeless prairie. There are very few trees on those plains, except along creeks and rivers. Whereas in the northeast and southeast woodlands, for example, the forests were very, very thick. And I heard one anthropologist say that it would have been possible hundreds of years ago, before Europeans came, for a squirrel to get in a tree in the northern, what is now northern Florida, and travel all the way to East Texas without setting foot on the ground. That's how thick the forests were. But this is the environment that our indigenous ancestors inhabited, and every part of it. And there were some basic lifestyles that we need to talk about, not for very long, just to acquaint you with what they are. They're sedentary, nomadic, and we hunted and gathered, and some of us were even agrarian. And sort of here's what they mean. Sedentary simply means inhabiting the same locality due to environmental factors and or availability of resources. It's a very sort of benign definition, but it's exactly true. Whereas nomadic is having no permanent abode due to environmental factors and or availability of resources. So the sedentary people stayed in one place and the nomadic people moved frequently, depending on the circumstances. And hunting and gathering is simply that, hunting and procuring game animals, including fish and fowl for food and shelter and clothing, and also gathering of plants used for the same things, food, shelter, medicine, or household materials. All of those we went out and picked by hand or hunted in order to have food and sustenance and shelter. So that was the lifestyle. That was a very natural lifestyle. And very few people, some people actually cultivated the ground and planted crops. That was not to the extent of the hunting and gathering activity. Obviously, shelter is critical. It doesn't matter whether you live in a warm climate or not. Shelter is important against things like rain and snow and wind and so forth. And dwellings were constructed from natural materials available in a given area. So all of our dwellings look different because we designed them differently, we constructed them differently, and they were made out of different materials. And all across Turtle Island, dwellings were made out of rock and mud, animal hides, plant fibers, and wood, and even ice and snow. Can you imagine living in a place like this? This is an igloo. And I'm sure you've heard of what an igloo is. This is the small one. There were bigger igloos than that. This is probably what would be considered a single family dwelling. But there were others that were multi-family dwelling and larger and higher than this, but were literally made out of ice and snow. Imagine in the far north, in the Arctic and subarctic, the winter stayed a long time in those days. So there were times when people didn't see the light of day for weeks and even months at a time, and they just simply dug tunnels under the snow from the door of one igloo to the next. And that's how they went back and forth and traded items and cooked and so forth. But this is how they survived up there in the old days. And in the northeast and southeast woodlands, then of course, because there were different materials available, then the homes and dwellings were made of wood. In this case, this is an Iroquois longhouse. And as you can see, its construction is different. It is one of the first multi-family dwellings on this continent. There were probably, in this particular drawing, it's probably possible that 3 or 4 families shared the one overall dwelling. And it was made out of wood. And here is something that I'm sure you've all seen pictures of, and that's the conical buffalo hide teepee. Buffalo hide teepees came along before the horse, and I mention that because horses came to the northern plains and to my people probably around from 1650 to 1700. And before that, materials and household materials and belongings were transported by large dogs on what were called drag poles or travois, where those long poles were tied to the back of the dogs and material was piled on, and the dogs carried that, dragged that. And so there were these same kind of conical teepees, but in those days they were smaller because dogs couldn't carry very much. Once the horse came, the design of this lodge was the same, but it got bigger because the horse could carry more. So a lodge like this on the northern plains, in the beginning, when dogs were moving them, were probably made out of 5 or 6 buffalo hides. Whereas after the horse came, then these lodges were made anywhere from 20 to 25 buffalo hides. So they got very large, and once the house expanded, the dwelling expanded, then the number of children in the family expanded as well. So this is a very good photograph of I think it is a Lakota teepee. We called it a teepee. It's a conical dwelling. And in the Southwest, most dwellings are made out of stone and mud. And this is a village in Mesa Verde, and you can see that it's built under a cliff overhang, and the walls and the rooms are made out of adobe brick. So my point in showing you these few pictures is that our indigenous ancestors made use of whatever was there. They used what the land in that given culture area offered in terms of material, be it mud and stone, snow and ice, buffalo hide, or whatever. That's exactly what they used. And of course, Mother Earth, or Grandmother Earth, or the environment, each of these culture areas was different from others because of climate, because of weather, because of terrain, the kinds of plants and animals that lived there, and the resources that were available. So, and as I pointed out a minute ago, our ancestors made the best possible use of what was available to them in each of these given areas. And of course, the environment was our teacher. And the first and foremost lesson, and a very enduring lesson that we still are aware of today, is that the natural environment taught the indigenous people of Turtle Island how to adapt. They taught the lesson of adaptation. They didn't go from one place to another to change the land and to make it more to their satisfaction. Instead, they changed according to what the land had to offer, and that's adaptation. And that's the ability that they had, because they didn't have the power to change the land or the landscape. They couldn't control the weather, but they themselves did have the ability to adapt. And of course, the realities of the environment of Grandmother Earth, the weather, the terrain, the climate, the kinds of animals and plants that were there, influenced the lifestyles of nomadic people, indigenous people. Hence, some were sedentary. If you lived in the really, really thick forests of the northeast and southeast woodlands, then it was harder to move freely. That's why villages were permanent. People went off to hunt in season, but by and large, their dwellings, their villages stayed in one place because, for the simple reason, the forest made it hard to move. Whereas on the open plains in the center of the country, it was wide open country. So it was easier to move. So that's what I mean when the environment itself more or less dictated the kind of lifestyle that the indigenous people live. And because of all of this, because of the impact and of weather and terrain and plants and animals from the Arctic to all the way down to Central America, we were different from each other. Our ancestors were different from each other because the kinds of dwellings they made, they built, the kind of game they hunted and used, the foods they ate, the languages they spoke, the clothing they wore, and the medicines they used were all different because they were different in each of those culture areas. There were some similarities, but not much. And we even are different in stature and appearance. Some people are taller and slender than others. Others are more shorter and more squatter than others. But there's one thing that we all have in common, and that's brown skin. In that sense, we're all the same. And depending on where we lived, indigenous people fished and they hunted for whatever was out there, large game, small game, rabbits, squirrels, whatever was there, deer, elk, bison, moose, because that's what they depended on for sustenance and for clothing and shelter. And some of the coastal people, believe it or not, on the Northwest coast and the California coast, went out on the ocean in wooden canoes or canoes made out of skin, either one, to hunt whales, believe it or not. And people who lived in the north, in the snow country, learned how to make sleds and snowshoes to get along in the snow. People who lived in the desert learned how to irrigate their crops. And the people who lived along the rivers and the lakes knew how to make canoes and fish traps. That's so they could harvest what they needed from the environment. And I hate to maybe burst some of your bubbles, but we were not environmentalists or tree huggers. And we did not go tripping lightly through the forest. But we did know the environment intimately. We knew its whims, we knew its cycles, we knew everything about the natural environment, about plants and animals. And the one lesson that we took from that was that we never harvested more than we could use at any one given time. And that characteristic, that habit, made us very non-materialistic. We didn't accumulate a lot of things. Our economy wasn't based on a monetary system. It was based on bartering and trade. So we only harvested things that we needed to use for ourselves or we needed to trade. So again, there were no noble savages. We didn't go around hugging trees. We certainly liked trees. We understood them. We sat in their shade. We liked to listen to the wind and the willows and all of those things. But that's the way it was. So, and here's an image I thought you might find interesting. This is what it was like bison hunting on the plains. Now, those of you unfamiliar with bison or buffalo, if they're known by either term, an adult bison stands between 5 and 6 feet at the shoulder, at the hump. They're tallest at the hump. And they could weigh up to 2,000 pounds. The average weight of an adult was probably about 1,500 pounds, 1,500 pounds. And they could outrun a horse. They could run upwards of 40 miles an hour. And horses were naturally afraid of bison. So what you see in this sketch is not just simply a man on horseback pointing his bow and arrow at his prey or his quarry. That horse had to be very, very fast, and it had to be taught to get over his or her inherent fear of buffalo. And that buffalo runner, as we Lakota called him, that buffalo hunter with the horse, it took years and years of training to get them to do this very simple thing of chasing a bison. So, you could, if you assume that this is a very dangerous thing, it was. A lot of hunters who chased bison this way were killed or injured because, for one thing, a buffalo can turn back on its hunter, on the man chasing him, or the ground could be uneven and the horse could step in a hole. All kinds of things can happen. So while it was a very exciting thing to do, it was also a very dangerous thing to do. So imagine riding pell-mell across the prairie at about 30, 35 miles an hour, trying to put an arrow into an animal that weighed nearly a ton. And it wasn't just one arrow. if you saw the movie Dances with Wolves in the buffalo hunting scene where the hunter shot the arrow and the buffalo slid to the ground, that was totally fabrication. It didn't happen that way. It took 3 or 4 arrows to kill one bison, because an arrow did not kill by impact. It killed by bleeding out. So this hunter would have had to chase down this buffalo over a period of time, maybe half an hour to an hour, to put 3 or 4 arrows into it. And eventually that buffalo would keep on running until it lost enough blood and it would collapse. So those are some of the realities of buffalo hunting on the plains. And here is an interesting sketch of people in a very small canoe, looked like a kayak, getting ready to throw a harpoon into a very, very large whale. And of course, this had its dangers as well. So again, it was exciting, and again, it was dangerous. But this is what human beings, the indigenous human beings, did on Turtle Island in order to survive. And if we were anything, our indigenous ancestors were anything, they were realists. They understood the whims and unpredictability of the natural world, and that understanding and that knowledge helped them to survive. And they thrived because they adapted to their environment instead of resisting it or trying to change it. European man came and changed this whole continent in the span of a few hundred years. And that's why the world is the way it is for us now, for all of us. Because they brought with them their square houses and their roads and everything else that made them feel comfortable. And seeking their own comfort, they changed an entire continent. And they destroyed 60% of the plants and animals that lived here. But for us, the spiritual beliefs that we have today, still today, were formed and based on the realities of our relationship with nature and the forces and the power that nature had and has. And so that's why we have the label or the name Mother Earth or Grandmother Earth, because those labels demonstrate our respect and our affection for the earth itself. Because to us, because we're realists, we knew that all life came from the earth, and eventually all life returned to the earth. So that's why we love and we respect our environment. We love and we respect Grandmother Earth. And as far as animals were concerned, we respected them because they had a place and a purpose, just like we did, just like human beings did, in that natural world that we shared. And because there was one basic reality: indigenous people did not consider themselves superior just because they were human. In truth, our ancestors realized that among all the creatures that inhabited our environment, wherever we lived, we humans were one of the weakest and the slowest. And every animal had some ability that set it apart, be it the keen eyesight of a deer, or the sheer power and strength of a bear, or the speed of a deer, or the sharp sense of smell of a wolf. Each had some ability that helped it to survive and set it apart from all others. And eventually, we indigenous people, our ancestors, knew that their ability to reason was their strength. And they used that ability to emulate the behavior and habits of birds and animals to help them in their survival. So that's an important word: emulate, or act like an animal, or behave like an animal, or think like an animal. That's the relationship that we had. with animals. And first and foremost, we respected them. We didn't look down on them at all. It's very possible some of you have seen a symbol like this somewhere in your readings and travels and so forth. This is a symbol that is peculiar to my particular group of people, the Lakota. That's what I am. I'm a Lakota. This is called a medicine wheel. And obviously it's circular. And it's circular because that's what life is. Life is a circle. Life is a cycle. And if you note that the two lines that go across it signify at each point, there are 4 points. So keep that in mind as well. And why is a circle so predominant in a lot of many indigenous cultures? Because it's a reality of nature. There's no avoiding it. The sun is round. That's the reality. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, that's one reality you cannot deny. The sun is round. So is the moon. So with those realities, those are things we cannot ignore. They're part of the reality of our existence. And so we incorporate them into our beliefs because our beliefs are based on the truth. They're based on reality. They're based on what's real. And there are the cycles. There are the circles and then the cycles. Of course, the cycle it moves in the circle. And the two biggest cycles are the seasons of the year. And for us, it starts with winter and goes to spring, summer, and autumn. And that's a constant. It keeps going around and around. And we will experience all those cycles during our lifetime, some of us more than others. And there are the seasons of life. And like there are 4 seasons of the year, there are 4 seasons of life, from birth and infancy to childhood, to adult, and to elder. So those are the 4 cycles of life. So if something is in the circle, then it's a cycle. It moves and goes back to the beginning. A lot of people ask me sometimes, and the question comes up very often, what is your animal spirit guide? And my answer to them, truthfully, I don't have any. And they're appalled because they think all Native people have an animal spirit guide. Well, maybe some do. Some medicine people do. They have helpers, and some of those helpers are animals. And I suppose that could be sort of regarded as a spirit guide, but that's really not true for most of us. And while certainly there are a lot of things mystical about our culture, as I mentioned earlier a couple of minutes ago, it's more common for people to emulate an animal, the behavior of an animal, the trait of an animal, even the appearance of an animal. A common practice was to use parts of an animal, like a hide. Some hunters on the northern plains would take a wolf hide and carefully prepare it and put it over themselves and crawl with that wolf hide over them. They would take bow in one hand and arrows in another, and they would crawl into a bison herd because bison were not afraid of wolves. So that enabled that hunter disguised as a wolf to get close, take a shot at a bison. So that's what I mean by emulating the behavior of an animal. And so they use hides, maybe a tail, a wing of a bird, or a claw of a bear, or a mountain lion, or something like that, to invoke the ability and the power of that animal to use in everyday life. That was our spiritual connection, animals. because we respected them, because we knew they had as much a right to life as we did, and that they had abilities and powers that we didn't. And interestingly enough, since I mentioned the wolf a little while ago, one of the wolves most emulated, one of the animals most emulated was the wolf. Because wolves were fierce defenders of family, they were doting parents, and they were relentless hunters. European man, on the other hand, came from Europe with his innate inherent fear of wolves. He brought with him stories of werewolves and human beings being torn apart by wolves, and he brought that fear with him when he came. So when he came and he saw wolves, naturally his first reaction was to kill them. And over a period of several hundred years, he almost wiped out all the wolves in what is now the United States. But wolves are very misunderstood. Among the wolves, there were no orphans. If wolf cubs lost their parents, then other adult wolves moved in to take care of those wolf cubs. So there were no orphans. Wolves were very family oriented, and their so-called packs were realistically family groups. Usually the alpha male and female were the only ones who had children generation after generation. So the wolves, the other animals that were part of their group were their children and grandchildren. And so that's one of the reasons, those were the reasons that many indigenous people emulated wolves, because wolves to them were good beings, were creatures that had characteristics that were worth emulating. One of the first stories I heard when I was probably 5 and 6 was from my maternal grandmother. I was raised by my maternal grandparents. I was given to them when I was less than a year old. So in growing up with them, I thought they were my parents. And later on, I learned what the real relationship was. But they were both good storytellers, both my grandmother and my grandfather. And my grandmother told me this story when I was about 5 or 6. And it's a true story. It really happened. It happened to someone, and this occurred in a time before the people acquired horses. So it was after the people, our ancestors, the Lakota people, migrated to the northern plains. And as I indicated earlier, the northern plains is wide open country, almost nearly devoid of trees. It's rolling hills and flatlands and rivers and creeks. Anyway, this is the story that my grandmother told, so I'll tell you the same story. A long time ago, before the coming of horses, a woman watched her husband bring home a younger woman as his second wife. And she was disappointed and heartbroken and angry that her husband would do that. So she packed up her knife, bags of food, and flasks of water, and an elk robe, and she left the village because she was hurt. She had been hurt and saddened by what her husband had done. So she traveled. Her intent was to go east to find some relatives who knew that she knew lived far to the east, that were days and days of travel away from where her village was. But this occurred in the late autumn, when the weather was turning cold. The nights became very, very cold, and the winter was just waiting to arrive. And the woman knew the territory, and she knew how to survive in it. She was not helpless in that sense. So she traveled and traveled for a few days. And then her water, she replenished her water when she could. and she killed fresh game when she could. One morning when she woke up beneath a makeshift shelter of tree branches and so forth, she had discovered that it had snowed overnight and there was a blanket of snow on the ground. So she decided to wait to see what the weather would be before she proceeded, and it snowed again. So she waited in her shelter, and she had to wait for a few days because it kept snowing. So in the meantime, her water supply was really low and she ran out of food. And she could hunt, she could set snares if she had to, but she was hesitant to go out in the snow because it kept snowing. And after a couple more days, she ran out of food. And because of the wet snow, she had a hard time building a fire, even though she knew how to build a fire. And she was starting to kind of second guess herself as to whether or not she should have pouted and left her village. But here she was in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm without food and without water. One morning, she woke up, and in the snowfall, she saw a form sitting some distance away. She could see the outline of this, whatever it was, this creature. She didn't know what it was. It could be anything. It could be a bear. It could be a mountain lion. It could be a deer. It could have been anything. So she stayed very still and hid in her shelter and made sure she had her knife handy. And as she watched it, it approached closer. And she saw that it was a wolf. As a matter of fact, it was a female wolf. And it came close. And it sat down on its haunches and just a few yards away and kept a close eye on the woman. And indigenous people, especially my people, were not afraid of wolves. Wolves were not a threat. They didn't attack human beings. So she was not afraid of it in that way. She was just wondering what this particular wolf was going to do. And after a while, the wolf left, turned around and walked away into the snowfall. The next morning, when the woman woke up cold and shivering, she saw a freshly killed rabbit sitting not far from her. And she didn't know how it got there. She certainly hadn't killed it. And so she butchered it. She butchered the rabbit. She went out in the snow and found as much dry wood as she could. And she started a fire and she roasted the rabbit over the fire and she had sustenance. The next morning, the same thing happened. Another rabbit she found near her shelter. This time, she saw it being brought to her by the wolf that she had seen earlier. The wolf carried it in her mouth and laid it down away from the woman and left. And the woman cooked and ate the rabbit again. So this went on for a few days. And the woman, after the snowfall let up, she decided to resume her journey. So she went further east, and the same thing happened. And then eventually when she went to the place where she thought her relatives would be, they were gone. They had moved their village somewhere else. So she decided to make a shelter and find some food and get water and then decide what to do. So she found sort of a cave in an old riverbank, and she dug it out, and that's where she found shelter from the cold and the wind. She gathered herself dry wood and built a fire so she could keep warm and used her robe to keep warm, and that's how she managed to survive. But again, you know, her food supply was low. She had water nearby, but her food supply, and she had to go farther and farther to gather dry wood. One morning she woke up and there was not one, but several wolves nearby. They were all sitting there watching, looking at this woman. And she was curious. Again, she was not afraid of them, but she was curious as to why so many of them had come. And they had brought the carcass of a deer. They had killed a deer for her and brought it to her. So she told them, she thanked them, she spoke to them and thanked them for giving her food. And they sat for a while and they left. So she butchered the deer, she cut it up, and she had food for a long, long time, for days to come. And then she waited for the wolves to reappear, but they didn't. She began to wonder what to do. Should I keep moving? Should I go and find my relatives, or should I stay here and improve my shelter and gather more wood and water? And the wolves came back. And this time they stayed with her. But whenever she built a fire, they would move away because animals are inherently afraid of fire. So when she built a fire to keep warm, then the wolves would retreat a little ways, but they stayed with her. And then some of them would go off and come back, but one or two of them would stay with her. So she felt safe because they were there to guard her. And one morning, she woke up, her fire had gone out, and she was cold, but she noticed, to her surprise, that 3 or 4 of the wolves were laying in a circle next to her to keep her warm. And when she woke up, then they retreated a ways, and she built a fire and kept warm, and then some of them left. And then she would hear them barking and howling in the distance. And as the days went on and winter came and more snow came and more cold came, she decided to stay there, and the wolves kept bringing her food, and she would go out and gather more firewood, and the wolves came and would stay with her. 1 or 2 of them would stay, or more of them would stay with her. And she assumed that when they went off, especially at night, they were going off to hunt. And when one of them was with her, or maybe 2 of them were with her, they would speak to the other wolves in a distance with their howls and their barks. And as the days went on, she began to discern that the wolves had their own language. They had certain barks, they had certain sounds that they made for elk or deer or water or even two-leggeds. So as time went on, as the winter went on, this woman became more familiar with how the wolves communicated. And she had this relationship with them over the winter. She was very lonely for her own kind, but the wolves kept her company. And she was never, ever afraid of them. Eventually, of course, the winter passed and the snow became fewer and fewer, and there were less snowstorms. And then the green grass started to come up. And then the wolves came and told her, because she could now understand a lot of what they were saying, that there were a group of two-leggeds, her kind of people, who were moving some days from where they were living, where she was living, where her shelter was. And so she gathered up her things, and they led her to where those people were, to where her kind of people were. And they left her on a hill, and on a hill that overlooked the village. So she walked down into that village and rejoined her ancestors. And she told them why she had run away from her own lodge, from her own village. And some of the older women advised her to go home and make peace with her husband. And so she did. Some people took her home, back to her own village. And she went back to her husband and asked him for forgiveness. And of course, he was glad to see she was alive. He thought that she had died, but he was happy to see her because she was alive. And she moved back into her dwelling and lived with her husband and his other wife. And over time, she became known as a woman who lived with the wolves. And she could still listen to the wolves and understand what they were saying when they were on a hunt, when they were calling to each other to locate each other, when the parents were talking to the younger wolves. She understood all of that simply because she had spent the winter with the wolves. this is the story that my grandmother told me. And to me, it is indicative of the kind of respect we had for animals. Even though some of them we used for food or shelter, we still had respect for them. And wolves were some of the kind of animals that we emulated, because wolves were family oriented, and when they hunted, they never ever gave up. And we now know that when wolves hunt, even now in Canada, where there are still wolves, they fail probably 8 or 9 or 10 times out of 10, but they don't ever give up. So that's one characteristic of wolves that we as indigenous people like to emulate. So on one hand, the European man was afraid of wolves, and on the other hand, some of us strive to be like them. So what now? What's happening now to us who are descendants of those indigenous people who first inhabited this continent, Turtle Island? There are some tough realities. For the past 200 to 300 years, we have faced the onslaught of forced assimilation and colonization. And as a result of that, we've forgotten a lot of our own history and a lot of our own ancestors' values and philosophies regarding Mother Earth, Grandmother Earth, or the natural environment. And some of us have turned our backs completely on it, on the past, in our own ways. But luckily, I think some of us still remember, or we try to remember. We try to remember the old ways, and we try to know our own history. We try to keep our languages alive. But still, to this day, the political and economic power of the colonizers, by that I'm talking about white Europeans, is a very formidable obstacle in our attempt to teach the world about the wisdom of our ancestors. And one of the things that we're trying to teach the world is that it's changing. You all call it global warming, and that's what's happening. And there's a reason that is happening, because of the kind of things that we do today to destroy our own environment and to affect it. And there are some other realities that you might be interested in. Our population in the United States, our indigenous population, is anywhere from 2.5 to 3 million. Now, when you consider that the overall population of our country is about 320 million or so, then we're less than 1% of the population. There are around a little bit more than 320 reservations. Most of those reservations are federal reservations. There are a few state reservations, but most of them are federal, in that they were established by the federal government. And 31 of the 50 states have reservations of some kind. There are about 700 ethnically identifiable tribes. By that, I mean ethnically identifiable, I mean that tribes still have their own culture, they still have their own history, they still have their own political identity. And of those approximately 700 ethnically identifiable tribes, 570 of them have federal recognition from the United States government. That's sort of a dubious distinction as far as some of us are concerned, because the very government that tried to eradicate us, that tried to wipe us all out, now recognizes us as separate nations. So that's kind of funny to some of us. And there are still just over 160 indigenous languages being spoken in the United States, 60 in Canada. But that seems like a lot, but when you consider there are 700 different tribes, then only 160 of us, our tribes, have a living language. All the others have lost their languages. And indigenous people live in every state of the Union. Right now, I live in New Mexico, although I'm from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. Some of my daughters are in California and Montana. They're all over the place. So we live in every state of the Union. And 28, believe it or not, 28 of the state names are based on indigenous names or indigenous words. And if you're curious as to which of those states, which states are, here you go. So you can see for yourselves, from Arizona to Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas. I know for sure Utah and North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, those are native words. Those are native names. So is Texas, Minnesota is a word from my language, which means misty lakes, Minnesota. So all of these states are named after an Indian native group or an indigenous group, or it's from a native word. Indiana, it's sort of a stylized version of the word Indian. So that sort of meets the criteria, but not by a lot. But if you're curious as to what those state names are, here they are. And there are some other tougher, darker realities. 60 to 90% of the indigenous population of Turtle Island were decimated by European diseases, such as smallpox and cholera. We don't know how many people there were here. Perhaps a few million, perhaps upwards of 10, 50 million, we don't know. But we do know that the majority of our population was wiped out by smallpox, sometimes on purpose. And the US government, with the aid of Christian churches, has implemented and carried out a policy of assimilation, where they were stripping us of our culture and our identity. And the mantra was to kill the Indian and save the man. And one of the things they expressly did was to forbid us to speak our own languages. And this was forcibly enforced when children were sent to boarding schools. In Canada, they're called residential schools. Here we call them boarding schools that were run by the Catholic Church or the federal government. And one of the rules was you do not speak your language. And people were severely, small children were punished harshly if they were caught speaking their language. And at the same time, we were forbidden from practicing our spiritual beliefs and conducting our religious rituals. So those are some of the darker realities. But there are some hopeful ones as well. A lot of us are making very, very intensive efforts to revitalize our languages and to maintain them. I grew up speaking Lakota and English second. So I'm technically a first language Lakota speaker. So that's a good thing, revitalizing languages. And in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was finally passed, and that enabled us to legally practice our religions. And before that, we could be punished, and a lot of people were, for conducting our own religious ceremonies and spiritual rites. And a lot of people were put in jail. A lot of people were put in insane asylums simply because they were practicing their religion. And there are 38 indigenous controlled colleges on indigenous land. We control those institutions. We're teaching our culture. We're teaching our language. And those kinds of institutions were established so that our young people could go to the university and college at home, and thereby reduce the percentage of college dropouts, so that more and more of us could go to college and after post high school education. So that's a very good thing. Interesting enough, we're using education, the same tool that was used to take away our language and culture from us, to bring back our languages and culture. And perhaps the most important reality, at least to me, is that we're still here. And what's in a name? All right, here again, I might burst some bubbles. Indigenous people of Turtle Island or North America who live in the United States have been referred to by 3 generic labels. Indian, American Indian, and Native American. In Canada, they're called First Nations. And we here in the United States were granted United States citizenship in 1924. So only, technically speaking, only from then on forward could we be legally called American. Before that, we were Native or Indigenous. And some of us, most of us, sort of look dubiously at those labels, Indian, American, Indian, and Native American. People ask me, well, what should we call you? What do we call you then? Well, my first answer is, well, call me Joseph, because that's my name. But if you insist on labeling me, then I'm a Lakota. And if you insist that I'm an American, then please call me a Lakota American. If you were born, anybody here who's listening, if you were born in the United States or in a territory belonging to the United States, then you are native to this country. So that makes you a Native American. So why then are you all using the term Native American in reference to us? We are indigenous people. And you're listening to and looking at one person who does not like those labels. I am a Lakota. I don't think of myself as a Native American. I think of myself as a Lakota. And every indigenous tribe or nation still in existence, those 700 ethnically identifiable tribes, we can trace our ancestry back at least several hundred years, and some of us longer than that, before the US was the twinkle in anybody's eye. So we predate the United States of America. We predate Canada. We predate Mexico as a European country. So we're older than those things. That's why some of us insist on being called indigenous or by our tribal names. On the other hand, some of us accept those names. You know, some people, that's okay to be called American Indian or Native Americans, but some of us are the opinion that we don't like it because that implies that we are the first Americans. And that's not true. That's not true at all. We are inhabitants of Turtle Island, and we were here even before it became North America. So we were not the first Americans. The first Americans were the Europeans. And many of us can know of the painful history, as I said earlier, of the interaction between Europeans and Euro-Americans and our ancestors. We prefer to identify ourselves by our specific tribal name. So I think it's good for you all to know that. So if you want to make brownie points with a Native person, don't say, are you Native American, or are you Indian, or are you American Indian? Say, ask them, what is your tribe? What is your indigenous nation? That's the way to open the door. As far as what's happening today, about 60% of us live off reservation, and 40% of us remain on reservations. And that's for a variety of reasons. Some of us go away to school, or we go away to work. We go away because we're looking for better opportunities and so forth. And on reservations, the median income is around $3,000. That's not a lot of money to live on. But being who we are, being Native or Indigenous, some of us work diligently. Social status is not important. Money is not all important. Necessary, but it's not all important. What's important is that some of us work diligently at preserving our languages and our cultures. And some of us work at informing other people about who we are and what we are and how we live and where we came from. And at the same time, we're part and parcel of this culture, this society, this mainstream society. We're like the slide says, we're construction workers, truck drivers, electricians, teachers, doctors, lawyers, carpenters. We're part of everyday life. Even writers sometimes, and so on. And 10% of us have served or are serving in some branch of the military. And that 10% is the highest rate among any group, including Euro-Americans. It's not high in terms of numbers, but it's high in terms of the rate, the percentage of us that are in the military or have served in the military. My father and my uncles served in the military. Two of my brothers and I served in the military. One of my uncles, my father's younger brother, was killed on the island of Luzon in 1945 during World War II in one of the last military operations, one of the last infantry operations of World War II. And he was only 19. So these are the realities of our contemporary life. And so in closing, I really appreciate this opportunity to try to create some awareness about the realities of who we are as Indigenous people here on this continent. Some of us still call Turtle Island. We know that it's called North America now, but some of us nostalgically still call it Turtle Island. And a word of advice, if you want to research on your own, please then read books and articles that are written by Indigenous authors. So you can have that perspective from the inside. And keep in mind, I say this because we're all different. All of our cultures are different from one another. And then watch those documentaries and films written and produced by Indigenous filmmakers, because that's happening more and more. And whether it's about contemporary life or past cultures or some historical event, then you will get our perspective, the Indigenous perspective of what really happened. So that would be my sort of parting advice to you. And again, I thank you for the opportunity. I thank you for honoring me by listening. And I'm sure that some of you have some comments or questions. So Lisa, if you want to read some questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Joseph. And yes, if there's anyone, we have, we're going to really stick to our timeline since a lot of us are on different, I'm not, but some people are on different time zones and some of us are in school. But we do have time for a few questions if you want to type them into the chat. And Joseph, if you want to take your screen off sharing, then we can see you larger. So
Sure.
There's a question, what does the future look like for your tribe, the Lakota, or other tribes?
I wish I knew a comprehensive answer to that question. More and more of us are being educated in the mainstream educational system. More and more of us are graduating from high school and going on to school. Two of my daughters have college degrees. One of them has a master's degree. There are more and more Native people who are going on to graduate school and those kind of things. I hope that the future is brighter, and I do what I can to make that happen with things like this. I take the opportunity to offer information, offer and talk about realities. And I believe that everybody gains something when there is more and more awareness. And I'm willing to bet that some of the things that you have heard, some of the things I talked about, that you have heard for the first time. I'm hoping that's the case, and I'm hoping you build on that to learn as much about it as you can. And if you do that, then there's hope for a bright future for us.
Thank you. Someone asked, I think I'm going to send that to you in an email about recommended books and movies. I'm going to include your incredible long list of books, but I think rather than go into all that now, I'll just do that through an email and
Sure.
We can distribute that. But there's a question, do you think it is important to inspire other Indigenous persons to pursue creative careers that help others understand your cultures and perspectives?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I became a writer, because when I first learned to read way back in junior high, when I finally could read really well, I read a book called The Iron Mistress, and it was about a man named James Bowie, about his knife and his life. And I liked the book because it was very well written and it presented him as a real person, which he was, although it was a fictionalized account. So then I started looking for books like that about Native people, and there weren't any. And what I did find was books that described us as savages, as pagans, as dirty Indians, as Redskins, anything but what I knew to be real. So that's one of the reasons I decided, well, maybe I should become a writer to sort of offset those misconceptions. So yes, the answer to that question is, of course, in the creative arts, whether it's any kind of art, whether it's writing, whether it's filmmaking, whether it's poetry, or anything, to depict, what is the truth about us.
Thank you. Are there historians or tribe elders working on the restoration of any of the lost languages, or have most been lost completely?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are 700 or so ethnically identifiable tribes and only 160 indigenous languages. So a lot of languages have been lost. But there are a lot of elders who are leading that effort to revitalize languages, because some of those elders are first language speakers like me. And I teach people, small groups of people, I teach my son and other relatives how to speak it if they don't speak it. It's an ongoing thing with me. So yes, elders are sort of leading that charge, and some of the Native institutions that I talked about earlier are doing that very thing, which is a really good thing.
Thank you. How can we educate and learn from the Indigenous wisdom to make all people better people and in honoring Mother Earth, etc.?
The simple answer is by learning the wisdom that came from the relationship that our ancestors had with the environment, as I talked about earlier. Because they lived so close to it, they knew all of its nuances, they knew all of its whims and cycles, they knew everything about the natural environment. We don't do that today. Not all of us have any contact with nature at all. And our ancestors had daily contact. And so that intimate association was the groundwork for all of the knowledge and wisdom of associating with the natural environment. So learn as much as you can about what various indigenous groups knew about the environment, because we all have different insights into it. And the one biggest lesson is that we did not take more from it than what we needed.
Well, that's definitely a fantastic lesson that we all need today, for sure. How do you, oh, what happened? My screen jumped. How do you develop your storytelling skills and connect to people through stories? That sounds like it's a big question, but okay. Anyway.
Well, if the question is directed at me individually, then I'm still working on my storytelling skills. I'm still developing that ability, because I grew up with my grandparents, and I had contact with their contemporaries, relatives and friends who were their same age, 50, 60, 70 years old. And every one of them was a really good storyteller. So I wanted to be like them. That was my whole goal in life, was to be a good storyteller like that. And I'm still working on it. And one thing is to know the stories, is to know where you came from, to know your culture, to know your language if you can, to know everything about who you are. And that means delving back into the past and learn about culture and heritage and so forth, because that's the basis of stories. And if you know things like that, then you work on the skill of telling a story or writing a story. And it's an ongoing thing. You don't ever reach a plateau where you say, okay, well, I'm as good as I'm ever going to be. That doesn't happen. You have to start, always stop, like, try to be better and better at it.
Thank you. So I'm going to just skip one question because I feel like I do perhaps want to ask this question of you. I'm going to put you maybe on the spot. Can you share your perspective on cultural appropriation of by European descents? For example, using the term like Aho, tribe,
Right.
that they're considered offensive by some indigenous people when they're used by European descendants. Is there a widespread viewpoint on this?
There are a lot of viewpoints on this. There's not one size that fits all. Generally speaking, many indigenous or native people who are aware of our cultures and have a connection to our cultures and our history do not like a cultural appropriation. We do not like images and pictures of, for example, a fashion model strutting down a walkway with a feather bonnet on their head, because we would never do that. We don't do that to other people. A person wearing a feather bonnet is akin to somebody deciding to put on a bishop's mitre and just walking around. It's that kind of an insult. It doesn't belong to them. And it hits a sensitive nerve among us, because it's not so much that, you know, we're offended by the appearance of a bonnet, feather bonnet on somebody else's head. It's that the fact that that person or that society just feels they have the right to do that. That's what we take issue with, and that's why we don't like cultural appropriation with images. With clothing and something, imitation, maybe it's a serious form of flattery, but there's a point at which it becomes sort of an insult. And I have no problem with being called Lakota or native or indigenous. I take issue with the less complimentary terms. I take issue with people who think that they can tell our history or talk about us as something of the past. Those are the kind of things that I personally take issue with.
Thank you. This is a person sharing that they live, and this may be the last question. They live in an area that has a turtle effigy, and they're wondering the importance of this. Must it be with the turtle island?
It probably is, not knowing anything about, other than the fact that it's a turtle effigy. If it was put there by indigenous people, it probably has something to do with that general myth of the mother turtle. So I'm guessing that's probably the case.
So there's lots of thank yous, and I will be sure, and we'll just email it out as a global email. Within the next few days, I'll contact you to get some references of books and movies and other things, and then we'll globally send that out.
Sure.
And again, it was just really such a pleasure having you here and having you share with us your perspective. It's so vitally important, it feels, for us to be informed. And thank you so much, and we'd love to have you be with us again.
Certainly, why not? And thank you for this opportunity. I enjoyed myself, and hopefully I've started you thinking.
And I'll be sure to pass on the chat to you as well, so that you can also take in people's comments.
Okay, that would be
Of appreciation for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much to everybody that gave us your presence here. And for most of us, it's good night. And so we will see you all again in the morning. And thank you again so much, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.
So good night to everyone.